Welcome, seekers of hidden knowledge, to the mystical realm of the occult. Delve into the secrets of the universe as we journey together into the enigmatic world of ancient wisdom. Brought to you by your guide through the shadows of enlightenment, Wisdom Rocker. Uncover the mysteries, unlock the power, and journey with us as we explore the hidden depths within the pages of forgotten scrolls and ancient texts. Prepare to embark on a journey beyond the ordinary, where wisdom transcends time and knowledge is your greatest ally. Welcome to Wisdom Rocker. Prepare to awaken your inner sage. In this video, we will be uncovering the wisdom within the chapters of
Lectures on Ancient Philosophy. Written by Manly P. Hall. Chapter 13. Emerson's Concept of the Oversoul. In every human nature abides a Cyclopean self with whom, at long intervals, the mortal part of man communes. With this thought is introduced a new phase of Greek metaphysical speculation. The instructors in the mysteries declared that at birth each individual was assigned an invisible patron spirit called the Natal Daemon. This entity was analogous to the totem of the North American Indians, except that the totem was invoked by prayer and fasting, while the demon, being coexistent with the generating soul itself, became, as it were, the identity of the senses. By some, this natal demon was considered the personified aggregate of past experiences or the summation of previous lives. It was synonymous with the instinctive impulse nature, that inevitable product of existences which stands behind and urges the issues of the outer life. This natal demon is the composite self, the sum of countless previous selves, the personality compounded of multiple personalities, the thinking, feeling and actuating sensory organism of material urge, the superphysical byproduct of temporal achievement. The natal demon is the god who protects the fool, making it impossible for man to actually undo himself beyond redemption. It is the patron saint of the outer life, the intuitively sensed superiority, the intangible authority by which mortal man is given courage to assert his participation in a divine energy. According to the Egyptians, the natal demon is created by the converging celestial rays at the time of nativity. It becomes the intangible cause of dispositions, and through its agencies two individuals, though similarly organized, neither think nor feel the same, but work out their diverging destinies motivated by this demoniacal part. Plato writes, Apuleius on the god of Socrates, asserts that a peculiar demon is allotted to every man, who is a witness and a guardian of his conduct in life, who, without being visible to anyone, is always present, and who is an arbitrator not only of his deeds, but also of his thoughts. But when, life being finished, the soul returns, to the judges of its conduct, then the demon who presided over it immediately seizes and leads it as his charge to judgment, and is there present with it while it pleads its cause. Hence, this demon reprehends it, if it has acted on any false pretense, solemnly confirms what it says, if it asserts anything that is true, and conformably to its testimony passes sentence. All you, therefore, who hear this divine opinion of Plato, as interpreted by me, so form your minds to whatever you may do, or to whatever may be the subject of your meditation, that you may know there is nothing concealed from those guardians either within the mind, or external to it, but that the demon who presides over you inquisitively participates of all that concerns you, sees all things, understands all things, and in the place of conscience dwells in the most profound recesses of the mind. For he of whom I speak is a perfect guardian, a singular prefect, a domestic speculator, a proper curator, an intimate inspector, an assiduous observer, an inseparable arbiter, a reprobator of what is evil, an approver of what is good, and if he is legitimately attended to, sedulously known and religiously worshipped, in the way in which he was reverenced by Socrates with justice and innocence, will be a predictor in things uncertain, a premonitor in things dubious, a defender in things dangerous, and an assistant in want. He will also be able, by dreams, by tokens, and perhaps also manifestly, when the occasion demands it, to avert from you evil, increase your good, raise your depressed, support your falling, illuminate your obscure, govern your prosperous and correct your adverse circumstances. The natal demon is declared by Olympiodorus to be the supreme flower of the soul, for it is the blossoming of soul qualities. To a certain extent the soul is generated from the interplay of action and reaction in the sphere of sense. The soul is the garment woven from the threads of incident, the natal demon is consciousness born of experience, the realization begotten of necessity. The natal demon is the diamond soul, the transmutation of corporeality into incorporeality, the regeneration of bodily quantities into bodiless qualities. For the natal demon is the wholeness of consciousness which must ever result from the coordination of heterogeneous parts. In the terms of mathematics, natal demon is the spirit of the number 6, which is invoked by the coming together of 6 monads and is inseparable from them as long as they continue to constitute a unit or wholeness. The natal demon must therefore be regarded as the consciousness of the senses conceived as a monad and established at the summit of the pyramid of sense, from whence it flows downward to tincture with that understanding based upon experience the entire structure of the corporeal perceptions. The philosophers declared that a natal demon, or familiar, is assigned to every man, with whom it remains until the rational soul, having been elevated above the sphere of the senses and having achieved comparative illumination, turns to the contemplation of superessential verities. Upon one who had achieved this distinction the Greeks conferred the appellation of hero. A hero was one who had heroically turned from the contemplation of the temporal to the contemplation of the eternal and consequently was dedicated to the service of the gods. Gazing rapturously upon the faces of the ungenerated ones, the heroes verged toward certain divinities with more ardor than to others, thus, expressing the innate preferences of their dispositions. The heroes, therefore, were divided among the orders of the gods, each serving his own preference and by degrees coming to be identified with the qualities of his chosen deity. As the gods themselves are incapable of descending into the corporeal sphere, they incline toward it through their vassals, the heroes. As a result, certain men have come to be revered as divine incarnations and the creative principles venerated under their similitudes. Unable to discern that the hero is not a god, the non-philosophic have befogged the issues of theology, with the result that men have become the worshippers of men and have propitiated mortal heroes before the superessential gods. While ordinary mortals, being as yet rationally unawakened, depend largely upon their natal demon, the heroes, or those already approaching liberation are the beneficiaries of a more exalted genius, denominated the essential demon. The father, star of the Neoplatonists is this essential demon, into whose nature the natal demon has been merged by a process in which the lesser is mingled with the greater and their issues become one. The essential demon is unapproachable by him who is still a servant to his sense perceptions. Nor can the essential demon descend into man, but as a silent watcher must brood over the irrational soul until, emerging from its chrysalis of materiality, it spreads its spiritual wings and soars swiftly to the source of its own light. In Homer's Odyssey, Ulysses is revealed to be a mortal aspiring to the estate of a hero, which end he attains by his perilous voyaging through the seas of temporal uncertainty. As the senses must be mastered before that which is above the senses can be liberated, one of the labors of Ulysses was the blinding of the Cyclops. This giant signified Ulysses' own natal demon, his self-will, whose power must be destroyed before divine will could be seated in its place. The Cyclops is, therefore, a monster of the astral light, the shadowy giant who abides amid the shadows of man's own being and whose single eye is the pineal gland, the only organ with which he discerns the outer universe. But it is possible for the eye of the natal demon to see two ways. By turning inward it ceases to serve the Cyclops and fixes its gaze upon the splendid features of the essential demon who, abiding in the sphere of pure intellect ion, is the father star, the pole star by which the mariner of life steers the bark of his own soul into the safe harbor of divine perfection. The philosophy of demons is the outgrowth of man's natural veneration for the rationality manifest in every order of life and form. The very clouds scudding across the sky exist by virtue of the intercession of rational intelligence, and upon fulfillment of their destiny are dissipated by the activity of this selfsame intelligence. A peculiar providence equips every organism with the instruments of its own survival. The plant's vital seed is protected by a stalwart husk and the life of the crustacea by its defensive shell. The urge that causes irrational nature to act in a rational manner we call instinct. To the ancient philosopher, however, the flowering of plants, the propagation of species, the tinting of rocks and crystals, the motions of the elements and the emotions of the soul, all these were regarded alike as evidence of the presence of invisible but powerful spirits, demons, who, seated in the causal nature of the manifesting sphere, guided primitive lives to the fulfillment of the predestined ends of universal procedure. Some of these demons are analogous to the elemental spirits of Paracelsus, with whose characteristics the great Swiss physician was made familiar by Arabian sorcerers. Recognizing all diversified activities to be suspended from causal unities, the philosopher of antiquity realized that while green, for example, dominates the color scheme of numberless organisms, green is itself a monad or unity, its intrinsic nature being coetaneous with a rational demon. The orderly or rational distribution of green is thus effected through the ministrations of this guardian spirit, which is synonymous with the very nature of green itself. To attribute rationality to a tube of pigment at first may appear to be a baseless concept. Those who have experimented most with colors realize, however, that they have an inherent orderliness and are very much alive, possessing the power to excite pleasure or displeasure and through their intermingling to demonstrate various complexions of universal order. As the salamander is born by the very friction that ignites the sulfur match, so a demon is spontaneously produced through every combination of forces, substances, or circumstances, becoming the patron of such combinations and remaining with them until divine procedure returns these combinations to their original simplicity. The belief in guardian spirits is a very lofty one when the unfolding rationality of man permits him to regard these entities as ever beautiful and virtuous. On the other hand, untutored peoples consider these transcendental entities to be innately malevolent, conspiring against human beings and seeking to spread sorrow and mischief throughout the world. The idealism of the Greek aestheticians enabled them to recognize divine agency in all that was beautiful, in that divinities rejoiced in the harmonious combinations of substances and circumstances. Accordingly, a place of beauty must needs be the dwelling of a thing of beauty. In somber groves dwelt grave dryads formed of the soft shadow that lingered there, in the high-flung spray of waterfalls nymphs disported themselves, while diminutive but pompous gnomes industriously hoarded beechnuts against the possibility of 7 lean years. Though these creatures were invisible to the normal sight, man was conscious of their presence. They were indeed creations of place, the products of environment and necessary to the setting of the picture. All these creatures are demons of different orders, for there are not only vast spirits whose bodies are stars, but demons so small that they seek the shelter of toadstools or play hide-and-seek among the blades of grass. The demon is the spirit of feeling that is born of and is inseparable from the circumstance that gives it birth. It is the preserver of universal order in the lesser, the untiring minister to parts, the protector and patron of unfolding life. Just what relation, then, does the Oversoul of Emerson bear to the god of Socrates, that strange yet exalted spirit which impelled the Athenian commoner to a martyr's end? Emerson, the Occidental Orientalist, thus, defines what he conceives to be that common Oversoul of whose nature we all partake and which is the common measure of us all, the supreme critic on all the errors of the past and the present and the only prophet of that which must be. is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, that common heart, of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission. That overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what he is and to speak from his character and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends and aims to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. It is a philosophic axiom that as we verge toward cause we verge toward simplicity, and as we depart from cause we incline toward complexity, for all things are simple in their beginnings, complex in their midmost parts and simple again in their ends. As man passes from childishness through maturity to childishness, so life, according to the doctrines of Herbert Spencer, is from simple homogeneity to complex heterogeneity and from heterogeneity back again to homogeneity. Approach to simplicity, then, presumes an ever-decreasing number of parts, until ultimate simplicity is utter privation of partition. Emerson clearly senses the common unity of cause, that vast monad which is our common parent and whose sufficiency is the one noble reality. This is indeed the great Daemon, the supreme soul invoked by existence, whose ministrations we manifest in common and whose edicts are the code of our lives. As we increase in rationality we become diffused among or enter into the inner nature of an ever-increasing number of organisms, thereby becoming capable of knowing and feeling the impulses which actuate these organizations. Thus, man became the oversoul of men, the atom, or archetypal one from whom issue the many, the protogonas from whose nature as from the pores of the skin come forth the sweat-born and the establishment of generations. Thus, man, the oversoul, is the anthropos, or demoniacal spirit which is the common father of infinite progeny, the vast sphere of influence which men can never escape, but which is their allness and against the sovereignty of which they vainly struggle, ignorant of the fact that it is their common life. The oversoul alone is man, for men are but fractional parts of themselves and are never complete until all together form one grand nature. Therefore, while all men differ in their outer lives, in their inner life there is this common ground whereon all stand together and upon which they must erect the citadel of their strength. Only to the dreamer, who sees not with his eyes, but with his soul, is the dignity of the anthropos apparent. Only the mystic can comprehend that vast being which towers above the puny sensibilities of mortals and from the lofty place broods over the body of its sovereignty. This anthropos exceeds men to the degree that the whole exceeds its parts, for each part contributes to the sufficiency of the sum. The Neoplatonists differed from the Egyptians in their definition of the anthropos, or the nature of the all-containing self when related to the status of men. According to one group, all of man descends into the sphere of generation, there to wander for a given time in the confusion of sense and later by rational procedure to escape therefrom and reascend to the sphere of spiritual sufficiency. The more profound philosophies, however, declared that the ungenerated can never actually generate, nor can that which abides in the contemplation of perfection ever become immersed in the delusions of mortality. While the inferior nature of man, suspended from its monadic cause, may thus struggle for a brief period in the darkness of the moral sphere, the true self remains throughout this period in the presence of perfect order and adequate comprehension. According to this viewpoint, all of man does not descend into the realm of his corporeal limitations, but rather broods over the incarnating part and from its own state of detachment contemplates the attachments which involve the inferior self. Thus, man is more than man, he is like the oft-employed simile of the iceberg, of which only a fractional part of its great bulk is visible. This invisible greatness of man, unmoved and uninvolved and residing in the pure rationality of the supreme sphere, is termed the silent watcher, the Atman, who is the true man and of whom the lesser part becomes increasingly aware as it ceases to be conscious in its animal part. In this manner is man, the comparative physical nonentity, suspended from man, the actual spiritual immensity. Is it not this over-brooding divinity which man senses when he explores the depths of his own feeling and seeks to measure the magnitude of his intellect? Is it not this transcendent superpersonal one who is the true substance of man's hope and the body of his aspirations? Picture, then, the mortal nature of man who, obscured by the insufficiency of his physical perceptions and crawling worm-like upon the surface of earth, dares to believe in his own thoughts and assume the reasonableness of his own contentions. Then conceive the blind mortality which men call life to be directed by a great and observing spirit which, grasping the lesser life by the hand, gently leads it toward comprehension and realization. Imagine that behind the little you at all times stands the greater you, majestic, illumined, magnificent, who communicates to the earthiness which is your mortal body a splendor more than sufficient and through whose greatness the little you is made partaker of the greatness and goodness of all things. This is the Anthropos, the heavenly man, the supreme Manu, from whose presence man departs for his terrestrial wandering in the prodigal sphere. While Emerson conceives this soul to be within man, in philosophy we prefer to conceive of man as within this soul. As through philosophy we increase the dimensions of our internal selves, we gradually annihilate the interval between our human souls and this oversoul. Our internal selves take on the stature of this nobler part until, though our body be still of mortal size, the scope of expanding consciousness becomes tions of inspiration. We then understand the qualities which inspired Emerson to pen these words: the soul looketh steadily forward, creating a world always before her and leaving worlds always behind her. She has no dates, no rights, nor persons, nor specialties, nor men. The soul knows only the soul. Ale else is idle weeds for her wearing. We now turn to a more detailed consideration of the intrinsic nature of the soul and the position it occupies in the composite structures of both man and the universe. As already defined, the soul is the first and chief of the generations. It abides in its own essence at the apex of the pyramid of form. If the soul, then, be a generation and not an eternal principle, of what is it generated and why is it superior to other generations? That which is generated receives its life from another. Having had this active agent once imparted to it, it is thenceforth capable of separation therefrom. On the other hand, an ungenerated being, because its life is inherent, must ever abide in that life and that life in it and hence is incapable of dissolution. Being a generation, the soul must consequently be included under the classification of bodies. Yet it is different from bodies, for being the chief of DM, it possesses a fullness of virtues which exceeds the fullness of any other body. Of inferiors, then, the soul is the superior and by virtue of its disposition occupies a midmost place between abiding life and unabiding form. As the physical man is clothed in a vehicle composed of the objectification and substantial counterpart of his superphysical corporeal impulses, so an invisible body generated of attributes too subtle to assume physical aspect envelopes the spiritual part as with an appropriate robe. Virtue, for example, is irreducible to physical perceptions. Seated, however, in the invisible nature, it manifests as an intangible and definite attribute of the self. Man is as surely clothed in the garments of virtue as he is in the garments of the physical. They are vehicles of his expression no less real than are the members formed of bone, flesh, or sinew. Besides the physical, man is the owner of many bodies, invisible however to those whose perceptions are limited solely to the earthly senses. Each of these bodies is the vehicle of definite potentialities which are slowly being manifested through appropriate organisms. Man lives in many worlds simultaneously, but of this fact he is unaware until he comes to realize that every phase of his temperament attunes him to a different level of universal activity. A concatenated chain of vehicles extends upward from the dense physical organism to the attenuated superphysical organism of the soul. These bodies originally issued forth from the soul, and to the soul they must return, or rather, we should say their essences verge, for soul existed before bodies and shall endure after bodies have ceased to be. Yet the soul is profoundly influenced by its bodies, and its nature is subjected to change by the reactions of bodily conditions. As the proper monad of bodies, the soul causes to issue out from its own being all that is inferior to itself. And by the same course that dominated their issuance, the soul reabsorbs these selfsame bodies back again into its own essence, for by this reabsorption is the perfection of bodies consummated. Man cannot enter into the presence of reality while still invested with body, for body can never contemplate the bodiless, form the formless, or the generated the ungenerated, as bodies, forms and generations are thus transmuted into soul, more correctly, reabsorbed into the soul substance. Man creates for himself a new and more subtle garment, a luminous sheath, a bodiless body, a form verging toward the formless, by which it is enabled to contemplate formlessness with comprehension. The soul, then, is the all-sufficient body, it is form elevated to the vanishing point, it is nature retired into its own apex and thus, rendered capable of contemplating its own cause. Through progressive sublimation bodies are caused to retire from their own materiality and incline themselves toward that spirituality from which they derived their actuating principle. If the fruitage of physical experience were apprehensible by the physical nature alone, then life would be but a span of useless suffering, for the deed would perish with the doer and the self be left as impecunious as before. Though every tangible evidence of physical achievement must be discarded by the decarnating spirit, yet there is carried forward into the invisible a subtle substance or pabulum extracted from incident and assimilable by the soul nature. Every incident, every experience, every conclusion of the physical life has its own soul nature, to be extracted therefrom by a strange distillation. The vapors thus distilled are inhaled by the soul even as the physical body subsists upon the material atmosphere. The distilled essence of incident thus becomes the essential nutriment of the soul, and the experiences of life are ultimately metamorphosed into soul qualities, becoming psychical urges and influences by which the outer nature is inclined hither and thither. As polarity exists throughout the sphere of generation, it follows that the soul itself, though intrinsically a monad, must manifest through the duad the positive and negative channels of expression. The soul is accordingly symbolized as two creatures, one a beautiful and radiant spirit subsisting upon the manifesting virtues of the life, the other an evil and rebellious spirit fostered by every unworthy thought or deed. These two guard the mystic gate between the outer and the inner self, for, as the soul, they are the portal through which the polar forces of cause and effect pass in mutual exchange. The radiant soul fashioned from the very substance of achievement becomes the animating principle of intuition, for what is intuition but a kind of memory in which particulars are forgotten but principles remembered? The mind may lack the power to reason through and the outer nature be uninformed regarding the solution of perplexing problems. But based upon ages of endeavor, intuition unerringly points out the law of probability, for by virtue of ripe experience it inclines with more certitude than the reason and with more discretion than the thinking but inexperienced personality. The evil part of the soul speaks also, and its voice is conscience. Conscience is the still, small voice of unremembered suffering which, long vanished from the conscious mind, yet lives in the deeper recesses of the nature, where it warns of impending catastrophe and whispers to such as will listen the standards of right and wrong as established by experience. Men and women of normal intelligence never commit wrong deeds which they do not know are wrong before their commission. We may dissemble or feign ignorance, but all too often we realize that we lie even while we speak. The Mentor of ages dwells within, and irrespective of our pretensions its words are audible to our inner selves. What is that accusing self from which the malefactor can never escape and which hounds the evildoer to the bitter end? It is the soul. Living its own life consistent with the principle of truth, the soul will never let us rest until our outer lives are rendered harmonious with the code within. Why are some happy, though surrounded by all manner of misfortune and sorely oppressed by offending circumstances? Because the soul, satisfied with the behavior of the life, bestows the sense of satisfaction upon these outer sensibilities so keenly vexed by an unkind providence. The all-sufficing realization of accomplishment flows from the soul, and like the balm of Gilead assuages the torments of the material Tartarus. The persecuted parts are imbued with fresh courage and conviction and given new strength to meet every emergency. On the other hand, why are so many who are fully blessed with this world's goods and possessors of all that should bestow happiness and tranquility so miserable, so abject, so afraid? Because the soul, dissatisfied, refuses to allow an outer complacency to silence its accusations. When man's soul thus convicts him of misdirected living, there is no tribunal to which he can appeal for mitigation of his offense. Shall we then wonder that the Greeks declared conscience to be a demon that eternally whispers in the ear of the mind, and intuition a guardian deity that can conduct the life through the perils of the physical universe? Intuition and conscience are the tangible expressions of the intangible soul by which man is made to realize that from every act a residue remains which shall influence his doing unto the end of time. Nothing that we accomplish is lost, nothing that we achieve is forgotten, for while the particulars may vanish away, the principles involved are interwoven into the fabric of an invisible vestment that clothes the self in the ample folds of experience and ensures that spirit shall never be without a counselor, or life without a patron. We have already set forth the triform constitution of the divine agent who through the one, the beautiful and the good creates, preserves and destroys the innumerable orders of beings. Apuleius, in the Metamorphosis, sets forth in allegorical terms the inner mystery of the soul. The legend of Cupid and Psyche existed, however, prior to the time of Apuleius, being preserved inviolate by the philosophers lest a profane world desecrate the sacred truths. A king and queen had 3 daughters, so the story goes, of whom the youngest, Psyche, was of such surpassing beauty that mortals paid her a homage that elevated her above the dignity of even Venus herself. The indignant goddess of beauty thereupon dispatched her winged son, Cupid, to humble the pride of Psyche by infusing her with a passion for some gross and unnatural being. Invisible to mortals, Cupid entered the apartment of Psyche to carry out his mother's mission, but became so enamored of the beautiful maiden that he repented of his role and schemed to win Psyche for himself. Suffering from the enmity of Venus, Psyche found no love among mankind, and in obedience to an oracle which declared that she would never be the bride of a mortal lover but that her husband would be a monster whom neither gods nor man could resist, she ascended the mountain upon which it was decreed she should await the coming of her unnatural bridegroom. As she stood upon the mountain top, the god Zephyr picked her up and bore her into a flowery dale, in the midst of which stood a grove of tall and stately trees and a magnificent palace which was not the work of mortal hands. The palace roof was supported by gilded columns and the walls were ornamented with tracing of beasts and strange creatures. Vast treasures of gold and jewels were also gathered there, and Psyche was served by invisible attendants who gratified her slightest wish. Psyche never saw her husband, who came only at night and departed before dawn. She begged him to permit her to look upon his face, but he declared that she must be content with his love and never try to see him. Desirous of putting at rest the worries of her family, Psyche sent for her 2 sisters, and these, jealous of her fortune, incited her to make an effort to see her husband. So one night when he was asleep she lit a lamp and carrying a knife with which to slay the evil monster described by the oracle, stole into her husband's bedchamber, and discovered him to be Cupid, the son of Venus and the most beautiful of all the gods. As she stood watching him a drop of hot oil fell upon his body, and awakened by the pain Cupid spread his downy wings and fled through the window, sorrowfully reminding Psyche that love cannot dwell with suspicion. The palace thereupon vanished and Psyche found herself in a field near her father's city. Broken-hearted, she began a quest for her lost lover, first seeking the help of Ceres, who suggested that if she go humbly to Venus and surrender to her dictates she might regain Cupid's love. Desiring the discomfiture of Psyche, however, Venus made a servant of her, setting her almost impossible tasks which Psyche in every instance accomplished with the assistance of sympathetic gods. Her first task was to separate a vast quantity of mixed grains, her second, to gather golden fleece from a large flock of vicious rams, and her third, to descend into Hades and bring back from Persephone, the goddess of the underworld, a casket filled with beauty. Still inquisitive, however, Psyche opened the casket in spite of the warning given her by the tower god who had aided her in the adventure. Instead of being filled with beauty, the casket contained a Stygian sleep which, loosed from the box, overcame Psyche so that she fell unconscious on the path. Cupid, coming to her rescue, returned the sleep to the box and, interceding with Jupiter for her hand, both finally reconciled Venus to the match. Psyche was then given a cup of heavenly drink which conferred upon her immortality, and in common with all fairy stories the two lovers lived happily ever afterward. In the interpretation of this fable of the soul's descent into generation, more correctly, its descent into the concept of generation, we must reiterate certain of our earlier assumptions. In the words of Thomas Taylor, in the first place, the gods, as I have elsewhere shown, are superessential natures, from their profound union with the first cause, who is superessential without any addition. But though the gods, through their summits or unities, transcend essence, yet their unities are participated either by intellect alone, or by intellect and soul, or by intellect, soul, and body, from which participations the various orders of the gods are deduced. When, therefore, intellect, soul and body are in conjunction, suspended from this superessential unity, which is the center, flower, or blossom, of a divine nature, then the God from whom they are suspended is called a mundane God. The Platonists further affirmed that the human soul was born from the intellect and soul of the world, but that its direct parents were the intellect and soul of a certain star, which is its father star and from which it first descended into the sphere of non-tranquility. As the soul is suspended between intellect and body, its fall, so-called, represents its inclination toward body. Therefore, the mundane soul and the intellectual, or supermundane, soul are identical in essence, but verge in opposite directions. The fall, or descent, of the soul into materiality is the result, consequently, of its contemplation of body, and conversely, its liberation from the mundane sphere is accomplished by turning about to the contemplation of intellect. The soul is an immortal mortal, for when mingling with the immortals it shares their permanence and transcendency. When mingling with mortal concerns, however, it is bereft of these endowments, becoming susceptible to a certain degree of mortality by which its luminosity is destroyed and its wings are clipped. From this we understand how it is possible for a soul to fall from its estate and yet still remain in that estate, for though it may verge toward the intellect or the body, it is still essentially in its own estate and remains soul regardless of the nature with which it mingles. Apropos to the subject matter, we have the remarks of Aristides concerning the descent of the soul. The soul, he says, as long as she is seated in a purer place of the universe, in consequence of not being mingled with the nature of bodies, is pure and inviolate and revolves, together with the ruler of the world, but when, through an inclination to these inferior concerns, she receives certain phantasms from places about the earth, then she gradually imbibes oblivion of the good she possessed in her former superior station and at the same time descends. But by how much the more she is removed from superior natures, by so much the more approaching to inferiors, is she filled with insanity and hurled into corporeal darkness, because through a diminution of her former dignity, she can no longer be intelligibly extended with the universe, but on account of her oblivion of supernal goods and consequent astonishment, she is borne downward into more solid natures and such as are involved in the obscurity of matter. Hence, when her desire of body commences, she assumes and draws from each of the superior places some portions of corporeal mixture. The same author continues his description of the descent of the soul through the orbits of the divine planets, from each of which, as in the story of Ishtar at the 7 gates, and also the descent of the soul in the divine pomander of Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, the soul receives a luciform and enveloping nature. At last, approaching the sphere of the moon, the soul becomes of such corporeality that a certain gravitation draws it into the rhythm of the physical world. The soul then loses its spherical form and assumes the human shape, the luciform and ethereal substances gathered from the stars first becoming fetal membranes and later definite parts of the physical structure of the outer nature and psychical qualities in the inner nature. For, as Aristides again remarks, the shell-like vestment of man is nourished from its own root, which is the descending soul. Psyche, or the soul, is described by Apuleius to be of royal parentage, thus, arcanely intimating that she is of a divine line, for royalty here signifies the spiritual lineage. That which has its foundation in the gods is declared to be of kingly order, for the gods were the patrons of rulers who thus administered their kingly office by divine right. In contradiction, mortals were regarded as creatures of common birth to signify that their mother was the earth and they themselves earth-born and not, like the gods, the sons of heaven. Psyche is further described as the most beautiful of all mortals, so far surpassing all other earthly beings in loveliness that men venerated her as a goddess and made her offerings similar to those with which Venus, the mother of generations, was propitiated. The soul is thus represented as exceeding in perfection all other material bodies, its beauty being due to its proximity to the fountain of beauty, of whose harmonies it partakes and whose excellence it reflects into the inferior sphere. The perfections of the soul surpass the perfections of the body even as the qualities of the superior nature surpass the qualities of form. In Book X of the Laws, Plato puts into the mouth of the Athenian stranger the following words, "And if this is true and if the soul is older than the body, must not the things which are of the soul's kindred be of necessity before those which appertain to the body?" Cleinian answers certainly. Then rejoins the Athenian, "Thought and care and mind and art and law will be prior to that which is hard and soft and heavy and light." Here Plato emphasizes the doctrine of the excellence of the soul over the body, for the concerns of the soul are more noble, more lasting, and more satisfying than are the concerns of the mortal nature. As mental activity is more beautiful than physical activity and virtue more excellent than pulchritude of person, so the ancients ascribed to the soul a transcendent and luminous beatitude. Sensing the felicity of this inner part, the outer nature regarded the soul as a divinity, in some cases, as the divinity. This misdirected homage is said to have vexed the higher gods who, since they greatly exceeded the virtue of the soul, should properly be the recipients of a fuller and more perfect devotion. If the gods, however, be impersonal principles, how shall we interpret that vexation which prompts them to divert their benevolence and leave the offending mortal deprived of their qualities? When man in his quest of realities exalts secondary natures, such as the soul, and loses sight of the divine origin and wholeness from which souls are suspended, he reaps for his imprudence irrationality, or the suspension of rational activity. Thus, is his mind continually vexed by its own unsoundness, and such disquietude in the rational faculties is declared to represent an offended intellect or an indignant divinity. The goddess Venus manifests a twofold disposition. The superior phase liberates souls from material generation and elevates them to those superessential generations which subsist from the apex of the generating sphere. The other and lower phase of Venus inclines souls toward corporeality and binds them in servitude to the generating nature, for which reason the goddess was regarded by the ancients as a personification of carnality. The great dragon or monster whom the oracle prophesied was to become the husband of Psyche signified materiality, the mortal nature with whom she must be wedded at the time of her entrance into physical life. The fabulous monsters of the ancient mystery rituals such as Behemoth, Leviathan, and the Hippocampus, all signified the mortal sphere that devours the souls descending into generation and like the Minotaur claims for its own the fairest and bravest of every age. Psyche is led forth to the top of a high mountain, there to wed this strange creature decreed by the gods, that her spirit might be duly humbled and that she might realize that only the immortals can escape the limitations of matter and the ravages of time. From this mountain-top Psyche is borne downward by Zephyr, the west wind, into a beautiful valley where stands a mighty grove of oak trees. This valley signifies the mundane sphere or lower world into which the generating soul is conducted. The east is the portal of generation, for it denotes the place of the nativity in a horoscope. So the west wind blows the soul gently into birth. The grove of trees signifies creation, which is, as it were, a clump of mighty agencies. In the midst of this grove is the palace of the world, where there are vast treasures and the jewels of the stars. The tracings upon the walls of the palace are the constellations, those vast signs upon the walls of heaven which hem in our solar system and are the limits of the mundane house. Here Psyche is served by invisible beings whose voices she hears, for having descended from her true estate, the spiritual agencies which are her excellence are no longer visible. But their voices still speak to her inner nature, even as the gods still speak through the oracle of the human heart. Psyche, however, is not yet physical and mortal, hence the physical agencies of creation are also invisible. Suspended thus, between two spheres, she wanders in the great house of life which she is eventually to discover is the dwelling place of Cupid. Cupid is chiefly familiar to the 20th century as the matchmaker supreme, but in antiquity he played a most significant role. He is the symbol of love which, according to philosophy, has a duality of natures. The first is that supernal passion by which the soul is moved while still pure and undefiled in the luminance of the soul sphere. The second is mortal love in which the soul, deluded by the findings of sense, exchanges for the adoration of internal qualities the infatuation for external appearance. Married to an invisible being, Psyche thus becomes the bride of spiritual love, into which union the element of form or materiality has not yet entered. She dwells in a beautiful astral palace, served by creatures whose natures have not yet been invested with mortal fabric. Here she remains until her sisters, who signify mortal instincts, begin to pull her downward into the sphere of sense. When Psyche beholds the physical form of her husband, spiritual love is changed into material passion. She is forthwith precipitated from her heavenly palace into the broad meadow of the earth where broken-hearted she wanders in search of the happiness she foolishly sacrificed by listening to the voices of worldliness. She then becomes a servant of Venus, who sets for the unfortunate girl a number of difficult as well as dangerous tasks. These tasks represent the labors of life, the misfortunes of existence which generation heaps upon those who come beneath its sway. In each instance, however, she is assisted by a heavenly voice which, representative of the ever-present demon or divinity, with its greater vision leads the soul befogged by matter through the tortuous byways of existence. When Venus enslaves Psyche, the lower love becomes master of the soul qualities and the shackles of desire hold the will in bondage to the animal propensities. The last task set by Venus for Psyche to perform is the journey to Hades to bring back with her from the sphere of the dead a casket filled with beauty. This casket signified physical life, which the ignorant soul believes to be the receptacle of happiness and beauty but which proves, upon opening, to contain only an evil and stupefying spirit. Seizing the soul, this spirit causes it to descend into the very depths of corporeality, there to remain until Cupid, or love, comes to awaken and elevate it to its lost estate. Cupid, the invisible god, is rational love, that affection which is seated in the true qualities of the soul. This higher and more divine emotion, rousing the rational soul as from a stupor, communicates its vitality thereto and thus, enables the soul by rational procedure to cast off the lethargy of the illusions of the flesh. Upon completion of this task Psyche placates the angry Venus and even wins favor in the sight of awful Zeus, the demiurgus himself. Thereupon she is given the heavenly drink and ceasing to be a mortal verge toward the immortals. She thus becomes the mother of joy, which is born of the union of the rationality in each soul with that greater rationality which is the invisible but all-potent God of intellectual love. Thus, is set forth the story of a prodigal daughter whose experiences parallel those contained in the biblical allegory of the prodigal son. Here also is the key to the allegory of Lohengrin, for the young prince of the Holy Grail is divine and unnamed love, which is destroyed or forced to retire when its nature is brought within the sphere of denomination. From the foregoing it is evident that the integrity of man is posited in his superior part and regardless of the physical inhibitions by which the flow of his divinity is impeded, that which is essentially good and true must perforce ultimately dominate the entire character. Not without just cause does man instinctively turn to his own soul for consolation and guidance. While he may not consciously realize the immensity of reality, he senses an expansive principle which, residing within the innermost recesses of his being, is ever ready to incline him toward perfection. Life posits its own awareness in the soul quality. Through the soul, spirit learns of its own apparent aloofness from, yet its actual identity with, matter. Clothing its own transcendency in soul, spirit gives its impersonal self into the keeping of a personal nature. Clothed with the rationality of a personal nature, spirit descends into the inferior universe to fulfill the natural law of being, that in the nature of perfect existence there shall constantly manifest generations. The divine plan includes an order of forms through which life principles continually flow from awareness through the veil of unawareness back to awareness again. In philosophy, therefore, we labor without ceasing to stimulate our higher natures and thereby rouse the soul from the lethargy of materiality, permit it to ascend from personals to impersonal, from forms to the estates of the formless, to be finally reunited with that sovereign voice of rational, or intellectual, love, that passion of the soul for reality, that impulse to verge toward those natures partaking most fully of the permanently beautiful. Thus, within human nature, which is incapable of appreciation in its fullest sense, dwells an all-comprehending power, the human soul, which ever seeks reunion with that omniscience to which each action of universal agency is, in turn, the object of a profound appreciation. This greater soul, this mysterious Cupid, this formless being which man may not behold without destroying, this least of forms and most of spirit, this is the true Oversoul in whose intellect ion we are perpetually immersed and of whose transcendency we continually partake.
Thanks for watching the Wisdom Rocker. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.